Well, our correspondent Rob Osborne is at Woking Coroner's Court in Surrey for us. Rob, Cheryl's family say they are deeply saddened by the suicide verdict today.
Yes, that's right, Andrea. This, in fact, is the second inquest into Cheryl James's death. The first one happened some 20 years ago and an open verdict was recorded, but not today. The coroner saying that Cheryl had intended to kill herself. And as you say, Cheryl's parents a short while ago standing on the steps behind me saying that they were deeply saddened by what the coroner said there. For years they've campaigned for this inquest, this second inquest, and today they finally got the verdict. Cheryl James died from a gunshot wound to the head. Nobody doubts that. But for more than 2 decades, doubt has surrounded the circumstances of it and place where it happened. Deepcut Barracks in Surrey. Now, at the conclusion of the second inquest into her death, the coroner had his say. At the beginning of the inquest today, the coroner said this was not a public inquiry into Deepcut 20 years ago. But throughout the afternoon, he did point to failings at the base. He said Cheryl James shouldn't have been left alone on armed guard duty. That was going against the rules. And he questioned the duty of care the army there had towards young recruits. But he ruled that Cheryl James died by her own hand. She intended to kill herself. This was suicide. Cheryl's family never believed their daughter's death was fully investigated. On the steps outside the court, they gave their reaction.
Deepcut was a toxic and horrible environment for a young woman, and we have no doubt that this would have had a terrible impact on those that were required to live there.
This is a long-running, complex story. So how did we get here? Cheryl James was found dead in Woodland outside the barracks in November 1995. She was 18 years old. 3 weeks later, and an inquest was opened. It took around an hour for an open verdict to be returned. No key witnesses were called. Cheryl's was not the only young death. Between 1995 and 2002, 3 other young soldiers at Deepcut were found dead with gunshot wounds. Police examined the cases but said there was no evidence of third-party involvement. But in 2014, after a sustained campaign, a new inquest into Cheryl's death was granted by the High Court. There have been questions about the culture at Deepcut 20 years ago, allegations of abuse, allegations of bullying, but the coroner said that if anything like that happened, it only affected Cheryl James minimally. The army always insisted that Cheryl James had killed herself. They said this on the steps outside the court.
I want to repeat the apology that I gave to the coroner and to Mr. and Mrs. James at the start of this inquest. We are truly sorry for the low levels of supervision that we provided for the trainees at Deepcut in 1995, and for the policies that were applied to using trainees for guard duties, and that we took too long to recognise and rectify the situation.
For Des and Doreen James, this inquest has been the culmination of years of campaigning. The question is whether now this will be the end of the road.
Rob, despite this suicide verdict, the coroner did point to significant failings at Deepcut.
Yes, Des James said a short while ago that although he was saddened with the recording of a suicide as the cause of death, he was pleased with some of the evidence that has come out in this case. But the coroner was at pains to point out that this was not a public inquiry into the culture at Deepcut in the mid-1990s. But he did say that there was a sexual atmosphere there. He said that there were far too few officers to train and look after young recruits like Cheryl. He said the provision of welfare standards were insufficient and that Cheryl and other young soldiers should not have been left on guard duty with a loaded gun. But some of the first words, as opposed to the last words he said this morning, were aimed directly at the James family. He praised their dignity and said that they had waited far too long for a proper investigation into the circumstances of their daughter's death. We expect to hear more from Des and his wife later tonight.
Rob at Woking Coroner's Court in Surrey, thank you.